My name is Jeffrey Michaels, and it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you to this panel on the impact of Russia's war on the energy sector in the European Union and the United States. One reason I'm so delighted to be chairing this panel and exploring this topic with our panelists is that for many years, I, and I think many others, bought into the narrative of the Russian energy weapon as being the equivalent of some sort of economic nuclear bomb, that if it ever came to a serious conflict with Russia, it would be, the energy tap would be turned off, it would be an economic catastrophe, and it was this fear that placed very important limits on the extent to which policymakers, especially in Europe, would be willing to push back or at least seriously confront Russia if it did something that we were opposed to. And that there was a general feeling that the best that could be done was to push back a bit, but not really much further than that. Policymakers might be reluctant to express this fear publicly, but nevertheless it was a reality that was driving policy towards Russia. But before 24 February 2022, this fear of the energy weapon remained, I think, sort of somewhat abstract. In previous crises, especially after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, the opposition to Russia, such as it was, remained within acceptable boundaries. And in turn, Russia chose not to meaningfully employ this weapon. Nor was there any major initiative to wean Europe off of its dependency on Russian energy. But then we come to 24 February 2022, and what had previously been an unpleasant prospect quickly becomes an unpleasant reality, albeit much more a case of a reluctance to import rather than a refusal necessarily to export. Therefore, among the issues I'm quite keen to explore is not only how the size, the shape, the scope of that unpleasant reality differed from the pre-war expectations, but also how precisely it has affected the energy sector in the European Union and the United States, to what extent the EU policy, US policy, the policy of many other states has been affected, and how it's influenced their policies towards the conflict in Ukraine, and what steps have already been taken to mitigate the negative disruptions in the short term, although how short the short term will be is quite debatable, as there are many views on the likely duration of this war, with optimists hoping that it may end within a matter of months, and pessimists expecting it to last for a number of years, assuming, of course, the battlefield situation remains more or less the same. Thus, one of the important issues at the moment is preparing for the next winter of discontent. Although, as we've seen with the recent winter, despite the hardships imposed on so many, it was not quite the level of discontent Putin was presumably hoping for. And finally, how are all these developments affecting policy on climate change, alternative sources of energy, on affordability, sustainability, and so on? So with us to discuss at least most of these issues, we have a superb panel. Each of the panelists will make a brief opening statement of about 5 to 7 minutes to set the scene. And once they're finished, we'll move rapidly to questions from the audience, as I expect we'll have quite a few, and time is limited. Our first speaker is Dr. Katja Yafimava, Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. Then we have María Sánchez from the Directorate General for Energy at the European Commission, joining us from Brussels. And then Ben Cahill, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where he works primarily on energy security and climate issues. So with that, Katja, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here, first time in Barcelona, lovely city, and thanks for coming. So in the first 5 minutes, I just want to outline a little bit what happened. So actually, Europe already about nearly 2 years into the energy crisis, because it had started to engulf Europe in the second half of 2021, much before the start of, much earlier than hostilities in Ukraine started in February 2022. There were lots of factors that supplies were lower than expected and demand higher than expected with post-COVID recovery across the globe. But of course, sharp reduction of Russian supplies is a very big, important factor. Clearly, no question about it. But the crisis was a perfect storm of all different factors coming into play in about at the same time. Of course, if you look at the scale and sheer magnitude of reduction of Russian gas exports to Europe, they fell in 2022 about by half compared to 2021, and again by half up to now. So it's really whooping reduction over such a short period, and that of course would have been felt in Europe inevitably, given that Russian gas takes about 1/3 in European gas balance. And just for context as well, so that of course you know that Russian gas is exported into Europe, was exported into Europe via 4 different corridors. One is across Ukraine, which is miraculously, by the way, still running, although not full. Another corridor is across Poland and Belarus, which is now exporting transiting zero. Nord Stream, of course, obviously now exporting zero because their 3 pipelines are exploded. One is still there, but it's not certified. And Turk Stream, which is also delivering mostly into Turkey and a bit into southern Eastern Europe. That is up and running. So it's really now only Ukrainian corridor with all the risks attendant, because who knows what's going to happen next, and Turk Stream. So the impact of losing such a massive amount of supply on part of Europe, on European part, was that it tried and managed successfully to compensate for a loss of supplies, first of all by increasing sharply LNG from all over the globe. Most of the increase in LNG imports into Europe came from the United States and also Qatar. That's, by the way, closely now followed by Russian LNG exports as well. And of course, it was helped Europe enormously. It's been enormously lucky so far because it was a relatively mild winter, which meant that demand fell quite sharply, particularly in industry, because prices were very, very high. And also mild temperatures meant that much less gas was needed for residential demand for heating, because clearly that plays a very important role in Europe, well, in different countries to different extent, of course. So that all very much helped Europe. So why I'm saying that is, although Europe has been successful now in averting the worst, so the impact wasn't as bad as one might have expected, as Jeffrey said. Again, of course, one shouldn't be complacent because there were lots of fortunate factors for Europe. LNG imports remaining strong because there was no pullback from Asia. Now China's recovering with this cancellation effectively of zero COVID policy. There was mild winter. Nobody guarantees next winter would be mild. And of course, Europe now faces a challenge of refilling its storages ahead of next winter, and it's going to be a challenge if Russian gas exports to Europe remain at much reduced level as they are currently. And don't forget, they are going across Ukraine, and that's the active combat zone. So it's quite a miracle that is still happening anyway. What it meant for prices, of course, prices skyrocketed first in February with the start of hostilities in Ukraine, about $40 per MMBTU. Then there was volatility and increase, and then sharp escalation in September when Nord Stream stopped any export of gas. They escalated at about $70 per MMBTU. And now they're back and back to the territory of about $20 the last month or so. So it's sharp reduction again. But just to give you a context, that before the energy crisis, the normal and on a high edge range price in Europe was about $6 to $8 per MMBTU, and $8 was considered actually high and out of reach for some countries in the developed in the third world. And even in 2020, if you look back in 2020, it was about $2 per MMBTU. So that just gives you a scale of problems. So prices are down. So Europe kind of emerged from this winter relatively unharmed. But of course, at a cost, and prices are pretty high, and 4 or 5 times higher than before the crisis. And of course, European governments did a lot to compensate, to provide cushion for consumers, both households and industries, with hundreds of billions being spent by individual countries. Obviously, not all countries can do the same. More affluent countries spend more, less affluent less, and to soften the cushion. And of course, the big question is for how long such might continue. Is it just 1 year thing, or is it going to be several years? Is it affordable, and where the whole thing is going? So what I'm saying that is sort of not to underestimate that this winter is gone, so everything's fine. And you hear a lot of statements, you know, that's kind of, it's all fine, there's no dependence anymore, so it's all perfect and rosy. But it's not quite that, because if it is entirely possible that there could be what Jeffrey called winter of discontent next year, for example, if Russian gas supplies are reduced further, if China takes really a lot of LNG with recovery, if winter is cold, if there are any technical problems, there are always technical accidents, of course, with gas infrastructure, particularly if it's running really tight for a long time with delayed maintenance, etc., etc. That cannot be discounted. In that event, there could be shortage, and if there is a gas shortage, the countries most affected potentially in Europe would have been Central and Eastern Europe, which includes Czech Republic, or Czechia now, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Germany. And of course, I'm well aware that the EU has adopted a host of various EU solidarity measures, legislation. They would have impact. They would help if they came to be used. But again, their impact would be limited. So there still could be quite difficult, challenging times ahead.
That's perfect.
So you exhausted my 5 minutes.
That's absolutely perfect. You're just on time, too. So now, again, thank you so much for that wonderful scene setter, very, very rich. So now we're going to turn to Brussels to get the view from the European Commission. Anna Maria, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear
perfect.
you perfectly and see you as well.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be in person today, but I'm really grateful that I could join in this manner. I would like to, I don't know if, I wanted to present on one slide basically what the European Commission has been doing along, of course, aside the member states, the 27 member states, what we have been doing last year. So I don't know, can you see the slide?
Yes, that's just come up, so everything is fine.
Okay. Very good. So basically, this is like a timeline of what we have been doing along last year, 2022. So basically, as Katja, the previous panelist, was already mentioning, the crisis, the energy price crisis started a little bit earlier than with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So we started already back in summer 2021 to observe some price increases in the member states, and of course we had to react. When I speak about we, it's the European Commission. So we reacted and we published already in October 2021 communication. A toolbox communication in a way proposing to member states possible energy price measures they could undertake to counteract this increase in energy prices. So basically those measures, they were like supporting directly consumers, companies in a way of one-off payments, decrease of taxation rates, etc. So you have been encountering all these measures. Either directly or indirectly, they have been announced through all the member states since then. Basically, what followed, of course, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February last year, and the Commission came up already as a quick reaction with a pre-announcement of what we call the REPowerEU plan, which we officially announced and published the plan in May, 18th of May. Between the first announcement in March and May, of course, we came up already with our first legislative proposal. You have to consider in this timeline, I'm showing you, we proposed 6 legislative proposals in total. And they were adopted and implemented by the member states. So this is like a record in time and in the amount of measures adopted in this short time frame. But this shows also the emergency, and that we were all reacting and acting. And this also shows a sense of union among the member states to to implement things quickly in the best of their interest, of course. So with the legislative proposals, I will just mention briefly all of what we proposed along the timeline. You see really that we haven't stopped working. So basically we announced gas storage regulation, where we said to the member states, you have to come up with 80%, you have to fill up your gas storages by 80% by November this year. And we have seen already first results. The EU average was 95%, so way above the 80% per legislation. We came up, so as I said, with the REPowerEU plan. Here we propose three main ideas, of course, to reduce the dependency on Russian fossil fuels in a very quick manner. And this has to be accompanied, of course, by acceleration of the implementation of renewable energies, increasing in energy efficiency, and also, of course, of diversifying our energy supply. So not having such a huge dependence on one country, like in this case Russia. So we need really to reach out to other countries and diversify the suppliers. And we want, to be fairly quickly independent. We are already in some of the fossil fuels independent, but not yet on gas, unfortunately. But we are on the way, of course. And so basically, we continued in our timeline. Like the next big legislative proposal was the gas demand reduction. So basically, the member states, they agreed to reduce minimum of 15% gas demand. And here we can also speak about first very positive results. In the first time slot we can observe from August last year to January this year, the EU average in this gas demand reduction is 90%. So it, again, beyond the initial threshold we put in legislation. So we are quite happy on this, but we have to still see further final results. Then we continued basically with, so this was before the summer break, and then we continued with other legislations like reducing not only the gas demand, but also the electricity demand. And here we included, apart from reducing a certain percentage, also we included in that legislation to cut the inframarginal revenues, and also introduce what we call a solidarity contribution to energy companies having quite an increased amount of revenues due to the high energy prices. So this is also another legislation we introduced. Then we continued basically with the acceleration in permitting for renewables, because this is a little bit where the member states are still lagging behind. There's a lot of planning in terms of renewables implementation, but permitting is always a problem. So we put it into legislation in a way to help member states. So they need to implement this shorter timelines to allow permitting. This went also through. We also included market correction mechanism for the gas prices, and that was it, a little bit like in a summarized manner. So you can see really that in a full year we managed to adopt, or the member states managed to adopt 6 legislative proposals under what we call emergency measures. So meaning that it was approved under the European Council and not with the European Parliament because of this emergency situation. And as also the previous panelist was correctly saying, this is, of course, we are not over yet, because now our main concern is the preparation for next winter and the coming winters. But again, this winter, it seemed that we came through quite fine, of course, with a lot of sacrifices from all of us. But our main concern and preparation is already going on for the next winter. And I think I stop here because I consumed, I think, my amount of minutes, and very happy to contribute now in the questions and
Anna Maria,
thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And the timing was actually absolutely perfect. So thank you so much. Ben.
All right. Thank you, Jeffrey. And thanks to the organizers of this conference. It's great to be here. I think it's an important topic you've selected. So I think my task is to talk about what the U.S. has done in the last year and how the U.S. has helped in this response to this global energy stress, or crisis if you want to call it a crisis. I think I'll cover this in three parts. Talk about the role of US gas and LNG exports, the oil market side, and then maybe the longer term picture of clean energy in the United States and how the IRA is trying to achieve longer term goals with energy transition to improve energy security. To start, I just want to take a step back. The Biden administration came into office in early 2021 in the United States, really wanting to focus on climate policy. There was a clear sense that the world was running out of time to deal with the climate crisis. The US had lost a lot of time under the previous administration, and they really focused on the so-called all-of-government approach to tackling climate issues. If you look at the staffing, the focus of senior leadership in the United States, it was very much geared towards climate issues and not towards oil and gas. They almost didn't want to talk about oil and gas issues. Several years later, the picture is quite different. I think the strategic importance of US natural gas and oil exports is clear to the global market. It's been a huge source of global energy security. And gas is probably the best illustration of this. The United States liquefied natural gas, or LNG, export industry is really quite new. It only started in the year 2016. At the moment, the US is one of the 3 largest LNG producers in the world, alongside Qatar and Australia. Very soon it will be the largest, and it's set to grow very quickly. We have a wave of projects coming online around the middle of the decade, 2025, 2026 period. And we're about to see another wave of US LNG projects about to be approved. And last year, 2/3 of US LNG exports flowed to Europe. So we had strong growth in this industry at a time when Europe really needed it. And we also had flexible volumes. The unique nature of the US LNG export industry is that you don't have fixed point-to-point sales. You don't have a seller here and a buyer here. You might have a buyer in another continent, but if they don't need the gas or someone else is willing to pay more, the volumes can shift. And what happened last year is that with the energy crisis in Europe, prices climbed, as Katja said, and it sent such a strong price signal that it really absorbed all available gas in the market. Any gas that could flow from Asia or from Latin America to Europe did. And this really wouldn't have been possible without US LNG. So, there's some unique aspects to US LNG that were really favorable to the conditions in Europe. And I know the situation has been quite difficult, but it would have been much harder without US LNG. On the oil side, some pretty remarkable events have happened in the past year. We had the EU embargo on seaborne crude oil imports from Russia in December, and then an EU embargo on petroleum products like diesel and naphtha and fuel oil and other things in February of this year. So essentially what policymakers have done is tried to cut the world's largest oil exporter, if you include crude and products, off from its main premium export market. And that is no small thing. But the market has adjusted remarkably well. At the beginning of this year, after that December crude embargo and the price cap was introduced, oil prices were around $80 a barrel. It's currently around $85 a barrel for Brent. And so the market has absorbed these huge events that have happened with the EU embargo and the price caps, which basically ban the whole global services industry for helping Russian oil flow by tanker to the rest of the world, bans all the services at above $60 a barrel. This is a new mechanism. It had never been done before. It was introduced by the EU and the G7 alongside the EU embargo. So there was a new mechanism. There was a lot of uncertainty about how this worked. Surprisingly, the market has absorbed all this pretty well. I think a major reason for this is that we had some warning that it was coming. And traders and refiners and all the people in the global ecosystem that help oil flow from point A to point B, they had some time to adjust. And it's created a lot of stress for Russia. The 2 main goals of the price cap were to keep the market well supplied, so avoid a shortage and a price spike, but also drive down the revenue that Russia gets for every barrel. And in the simplest terms, it is happening. I mean, we are seeing a big drop in Russian revenue, and so far the market has been well supplied. The role that the US is playing here is that the US has become a really critical exporter of crude oil and petroleum products. There was a ban on US oil exports until the year 2017, so this is a pretty new phenomenon. But as Europe has had to displace Russian oil and buy more crude and products from other markets, a lot of US exports have flowed to Europe. Some US products have flowed to the rest of the world, and it's helped keep it well supplied. I know I'm running out of time, so I just say the last leg here is really to try to find alignment between the US and the EU on these shared climate goals. And this is really setting the table today for the medium to long-term picture. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed last August, was the largest ever federal climate action in the United States. For many years, the whole world wanted the US to get serious about climate. We've finally done it. There's going to be a massive investment-led program in investing in every kind of clean energy you can imagine. Implementing it is going to be a huge challenge. Some of the challenges in the EU are common to the United States as well. But now the focus has to be on implementing all that stuff so that we don't find ourselves repeating this crisis years down the line, but instead we're in a better position. We have more diversified energy supplies, and we take the steps today so that we don't have to repeat the situation in 5 or 10 years. Thank you.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. So we now have about 35 minutes or so for questions. I believe we have a microphone somewhere. If not, you might just have to speak rather loudly. So if you just sort of raise your hands for questions and then sort of stand up, ask them. If I could ask you, in addition to your question, if you could also just identify yourself and any affiliation, and I would sort of just beg you to actually ensure that it is a question rather than a very long statement. So please, sir.
Hi, my name is Mark Mullen from Warsaw, our old resident in UK. For the uninitiated who don't work specifically in hydrocarbons, you'd often hear that Europe had Thanks. You'd often hear that Europe had a Russia problem and the U.S. has a Saudi Arabia problem. And as we heard from Ms. Sanchez that you know, the EU, the Commission, and even the European Parliament has done quite a job in dealing with that, much better than anyone expected. You know, Professor Cahill, you've got some Aramco experience, and you know, and before the big OPEC meeting, there were some hopes and some a lot of discussion about what OPEC would do, and they didn't really pitch in, and really it was felt that you know, that MBS was a leader in keeping the price higher than had been hoped. What do you think, related to the Biden administration's long-term climate policy, and also Saudi Arabia's, you know, habit of killing journalists and its own citizens? What do you think that means for the sort of medium-term relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia?
First, let me just make a correction. I said a minute ago that the ban on exports was lifted in 2017. It was actually 2015, but the big uptick happened in 2017, so sorry. I think one thing that's happened is that the whole concept of energy security in the United States has flipped in a way, because we had the shale oil and gas revolution happen, and we've become a big exporter. For about 40 years, ever since the oil shocks of the 1970s, the whole concept of energy security in the US was based on insulating us from external shocks, you know, from what OPEC would do, from exposure to high prices. And I think policymakers are still getting used to this idea of the US as a big exporter. The US role in the global oil market has fundamentally changed. In some ways, I think it's led to a bit of overconfidence in how the US engages with OPEC and other countries. President Biden made this really publicized visit to Saudi Arabia last July to ask them to increase production, and they didn't do it. I think there's clearly a lot of frustration in the Gulf states with the United States, mostly because of security issues and other diplomatic issues, but also they feel like the US is a little bit, it makes demands of them in their role in the global oil market, but it doesn't reciprocate when they need us. That's the perspective. But I do want to point out something about the US role in the global oil market. The trajectory of shale oil in the United States has really changed. For years and years, we saw enormous growth in US oil production and exports. In some years, it was 1 million or 1.5 million barrels a day plus in growth every single year, and that had never been done before. And that's changed. The sector is just not growing the way that it used to, because investors are demanding higher returns. They got fed up with very poor financial performance from this industry for a decade. You know, for 10 years, with the start of the shale boom, it was the worst performing industry in the S&P 500. And investors said, forget it, I'm not giving you any more money. So we've downshifted to this slower, more sustainable rate of growth, but it means that the US doesn't provide this kind of security blanket to the global market. So if things tighten, the US probably can't add that much more. And the OPEC states really don't have a whole lot of spare capacity to add. You know, when we have small spare capacity, the oil market tends to panic a little bit. Right now we have about 2.5 million barrels a day of spare capacity. It's really just held by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So far things have been fine, but if economic growth picks up in China and the rest of the world this year and the market tightens, we're not going to have that kind of security, you know, the release valve that we did from the US in the past. So that's something to consider and maybe worry about a bit.
A question in the back.
Yeah, thank you. Adrià Alsina from Universitat de Vic. You've currently pointed out that we were sort of warned of an energy apocalypse at some point that was thankfully averted. We were also warned about of an industrial apocalypse in Europe that seems to be averted for now, but we are starting to read lots of new news and reports that perhaps related to this new aggressive policy from the US might have been or might end up affecting the industry in Europe. So what do you have some takes on what may happen with the industry in Europe in the future, in the coming months or in the coming years?
Sorry, can I just ask, who would you like to answer that question?
Well, whoever has an opinion on that, I guess.
Fair. Excellent. Would you like to go, Katja?
Yeah.
Perfect.
I want to add. Well, that is a very big question, and of course, it's a very good question. It's a very big worry for European industry, and it's a worry which is well justified because, as I said in the opening remarks, a big share of why European gas demand declined, that's actually lost demand in industry. It's effectively very, very significant reduction in response of these high prices. And although prices went down recently, they're still five-fold compared to what they were. And it remains very interesting to watch now whether we may see some recovery of industrial demand at these prices this year. But I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to see that because if you imagine that things stay as they are, and for the next couple of years until this next big wave of LNG that specifically US LNG that Ben had referred to, before it hits the market, there are a couple of winters or years for Europe to go by, and that's going to be still this high price environment. Volatility, and because it's extremely tight market, so any of the factors I've mentioned, pullback of LNG in Asia, cold temperatures, technical failures with equipment, we can see the very same spikes as we've seen before. That's one thing. And even when market rebalances, when extra wave of LNG comes into the market, when market rebalances, sort of say in 2026 or so, it's still going to be a high price environment. It's not going to be back to pre-crisis levels. And Europe is going to be, particularly in the next couple of years, Europe going to compete fiercely with the rest of the world, which means high prices. And even beyond that 2026 and up until the end of the decade, it will still be in a very significant fierce competition with everyone else in the world. And at that kind of prices, it's a very big question mark whether industry could survive. I mean, a lot of industry could just decide, or will have to decide, will be forced to close down or relocate elsewhere where prices are more moderate than that. And I agree with you. It's a very big question mark for Europe, of course.
Ben, did you have anything to add to that?
I do, but I wonder if Maria wants to add something.
And Maria, do you have...
Maybe I can intervene also from the European perspective. It is a very fair point on the industry participation in this way to become independent at the end to become for the sustainable path, to become climate neutral. This is in a way despite the current circumstances, we still go on with the plans, the Green Deal, climate neutrality by 2050. We have a very stringent, very specific targets also for 2030 for renewables and energy efficiency, even increased now with the REPowerEU plan. But this all needs to be sustained by technology, by industry, because you can't, I mean, a huge amount of additional renewable energy capacity, also energy efficiency measures, which implies a lot of appliances. This needs to be produced. And of course, in Europe, we would like to have all this capacity produced in Europe, not again start to depend on other countries outside of the European Union. So there will be an announcement about a Green Deal industrial plan very soon, I think, still this March from the Commission, what is behind it. And so this is a little bit the idea about the European Union to continue being competitive, because we are competitive in some of the clean technologies. And we are very determined to pursue really, like, first of all, to become climate neutral by 2050, but before reaching all these very important targets, and of course relying on our own industrial bases, because at the end we don't want to depend again from third countries.
Just briefly, I would say increasing the share of renewable energy in electricity generation is the easy part. Increasing the share of renewables in industry and households and transportation, that's the hard part, especially industry. And there are no easy alternatives today to natural gas for extremely energy-intensive industries, like, for example, chemicals, glass, steel. Think of the big industries in Germany. The hope, I think, is that over time, hydrogen can play a bigger role in providing an energy source for those industries. Those applications probably make sense, but it takes a while to do that. And so switching from gas to renewable energy for heavy industry is really a tough thing to do. So I agree with Katja that the cost challenge is real for some industry in Europe.
Yes, please, in the middle.
Thank you. I'm Matthias from Matthias Yafimava from Geopolitics. So Councillor Sana mentioned how this energy crisis, this polar crisis, is affecting our allies and partners in the global south. So a few years ago, or last year, the EU announced the Global Gateway, which was an initiative to counter the Chinese BRI, and also the G7 announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure. But so far, these initiatives have come short in matching China's ambition. So my question is, how can we change the situation and match China's ambition in terms of energy infrastructure in the global south?
Probably not. I'll be able to comment later if somebody wants to start.
Ben, and then maybe Anna Maria, if you have anything to say.
Sure. I think one thing we've seen in the last two COP meetings is there's a lot of tension between developed and developing countries, and we're having different conversations about the energy transition. You can really feel that the US and Europe are moving on one trajectory, and a lot of countries are moving on a different path. And unfortunately, many of them don't have the financial resources or the assistance to jumpstart that energy transition. And they also feel like the historical emissions problem is not their problem. They didn't cause it. So they shouldn't be expected to have the same pace of energy transition. And they also argue, look, don't expect us to do this if you're not going to provide financial support and help. And so far it hasn't showed up. Most of the multilateral development banks, export banks, export credit agencies, all the tools of government, they just haven't done that much to provide financing for the clean energy transition. So I hope that at COP28 this year, we'll see a lot more action on that front. I think the US definitely has much more that it could do. But it's a big challenge. And I think, to be frank, a lot of developing countries have really suffered in the last year. You mentioned some of the countries in South Asia that couldn't pay these high gas prices. They feel like the developed world is showing a lot of hypocrisy in how they're dealing with this energy situation. In the short term, we're meeting our own needs instead of helping them, and then still denying them the kind of finances and support that they need to pull off a transition of their own.
Anna Maria, is there anything you would like to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, it is of course of our concern. There are like non-EU countries in terms of pursuing a similar path of climate neutrality. It's, I mean, because at the end of the day, if we see, okay, Europe in terms of the share of greenhouse gas emissions, on the global basis, we have only like our share is like 10%, but if the rest of the world is not diminishing it, we can be as climate neutral as we want in a couple of decades. This is not going to contribute to the rest of the climate. So I'm not very much familiarized myself now with all the international outreach we are doing in the energy policy. What I know is that we are, of course, exchanging a lot with other countries. I particularly know, for example, the energy community, which is at the end the Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia. We are helping them to transpose EU legislation, EU energy legislation into their national legislation in a way so that they can like continue the same path as we are doing at the EU level in terms of pursuing these climate targets, renewable targets, and energy efficiency targets, climate neutrality, so that they can a little bit mirror what we are doing. And this is what we are particularly doing in DG ENER at the moment. Of course, we have a lot of exchanges also with other like developing countries, but from my side, I'm more my job is more the relations with the member states and energy community, so I can't really report much more beyond this.
Katja?
Just a quick, just mic working, yeah. Just a quick, I think it's, well, yeah. Just a quick comment on this. You know, if again it's going to remain a relatively high gas price environment for the rest of this decade, that what it effectively means, that means that poorer countries in the world are going to be priced out of this gas market. And then effectively we saw that when Europe pulls most of this, you know, limited pool of LNG to compensate for Russian gas supplies, and then we keep talking about energy crisis in Europe, but actually it's important to point out so far there have been no physical shortages of gas in Europe. We didn't see, you know, kind of like blackouts or things like that, and then you can see pictures of Pakistan of sort of, you know, countrywide lockdowns and sort of pitch dark pictures. So then you see the contrast, and then you can see that why those countries sometimes voice the view that a certain hypocrisy on part of Europe, that, you know, Europe accelerates these imports of gas when it needs it. It drives prices up, and then those countries basically also being told that, you know, you can't have it because you can't afford it. And then how are you supposed to decarbonize? They can't really, in that price environment, they basically priced out. Back a few years before the crisis, you know, $6-8 per MMBTU, sort of the normal price, was considered sort of maximum they could do to consider this path towards decarbonization. And that creates all sorts of problems, obviously. And it's a very, very serious issue, of course.
We have just under 20 minutes for any additional questions. Yes, in the middle.
Hi, Oscar from Universitat Pompeu Fabra. You said before that the situation would have been much worse in Europe without the help of the United States in terms of gas supply. And Chancellor said that Putin have used energy as a coercive tool in the past. My question is, given the fact that the United States, as you said, had become a gas supplier a few years ago, do you think it's reasonable to think that the United States was especially interested in becoming the largest gas supplier of Europe, and therefore that they had a very strong interest in all this happening?
The important thing to remember is, you know, governments don't sign gas contracts, companies do. So there was an agreement last March between the United States and the EU for the US to step up and supply a certain amount of LNG. I think it was 15 million tons for the rest of the year. In fact, the US supplied much more than that target. It was something like 22 million tons. But all of that gas was supplied by companies that just bought it, right? It wasn't really a government-to-government agreement that made that happen. It was sort of the market working it out. And the fact is, you know, Europe had to outbid everyone else. It just had to pay a higher price to attract all these volumes. And, you know, that's economically challenging and it's uncomfortable, but it was necessary to draw in all those LNG volumes. Fortunately now, you know, as Katja mentioned, it's been a mild winter. Storage has remained pretty high. And we've had this drop in demand, you know, partly thanks to policies that Ana Maria described. So, you know, there's been this fear in the market for months now that we're just going to have to deal with extremely high gas prices for years to come. It's definitely a risk to consider, but it is possible that if we can keep this drop in demand, keep demand at a reasonable level, and if we don't have a huge rebound in China and China doesn't take much more gas, maybe we won't have these dramatically higher prices that we've seen. It is important to note that we haven't seen a shortage so far. I mean, we saw a lot of volatility in gas prices last year and extremely high prices, but we didn't see a shortage, and still the inventories remain high. So if you want to look at it through an optimistic lens, you could say, well, maybe we're not going to deal with these very high prices for that long. And if we can get through from now until around 2026, when we get a lot more gas from the United States and Qatar, the market should loosen and prices should moderate a bit. I don't know if you agree. Feel free to disagree with that market call.
One point, I guess, to mention again, of course, you know, supplies will come. You know, the next wave, you know, for develop new LNG projects, what one would have to conclude contracts, and then of course we see this discrepancy now that American buyers want signed contracts for sort of 20, 25 years. And European buyers are reluctant to do anything longer than 10 years because of EU decarbonization targets. They're legally binding targets, greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at whatever scenario you can think of, after 2030, there is sharp reduction. One only sort of disagrees about the angle of reduction in gas demand. And from European perspective, from European commercial buyer perspective, it's very difficult to sign anything beyond that horizon because they know that's the policy. Those multiple legislative measures being adopted as we speak for the EU to stay on this decarbonization trajectory. It takes it very seriously. The populations take it very seriously. And then they don't want to end up with their contracts on their hands, which they will not know what to do beyond a certain period. No one quite knows exactly what the point in time when not so much gas will be needed and what to do with it at that point. And that's a big, that is a big, a genuine problem. Finding a working contractual relationship which can develop, support new developments, but also that European buyers would be able to take those risks, and they're very significant, and for the buyer and for the seller as well.
Ana Maria, I saw you nodding a bit there. I wasn't sure if you had any reactions either to the question or to what Katja or Ben had to say.
Yeah, well, in a way to both, but to the comment from Ben, I agree that it's a bit now the big question marks we have from the EU side with all these emergency measures member states adopted. They are meant to be in force for a temporary limit, right? So we are a little bit like, well, first of all, some of those measures we will propose to the member states to prolong, but and we are ourselves also wondering if, of course, those measures had also this effect on the price level, right? Because it came down, and so it's a bit this current situation where we are in a new playing in a new environment, in a new context. So we will see. But one of the things the Commission is going to propose to the next Council, to the Member States, is to prolong some of the measures to keep these prices down. And also to the comment that this is a play, like gas market, oil market. It's a play between companies. Although of course it's always saying, yeah, the EU, the US, but we are in a way more the facilitators, facilitating these relationships with certain countries. This is what we have been doing now during this energy crisis, being there to facilitate the outreach to countries to receive more like gas in this case, but at the end the final contracts are signed by companies. Of course, we are from the public sector perspective facilitators. Another last comment, this was not mentioned from the EU side. We are launching very soon a joint purchase mechanism. This is again supported by the Commission, but at the end it will be companies will be participating. In a way, we launched this idea last year in one of these legislative proposals. Basically, we wanted to avoid what happened last year, that companies were outbidding, going to the market in a frenetic manner and driving probably indirectly the prices while they were trying to buy gas to fill the storage. So we in a way wanted to create a joint purchase mechanism. Also thinking about maybe not the big players, but also like smaller players, smaller countries, where they can come together, like the companies having gas and the consumers needing this gas. And this platform will be coming into play by April. So this is also a new tool we are putting in place, facilitating again the interaction between the different market participants, market makers, and let's see how this turns out.
Yes, question in the front.
Thank you. My name is Gernot from the EBEI. I have a question regarding the gas market. We always looked at the United States, Europe, but what about the gas volumina, which is going from Russia to China and India? Is there a significant volumina, and how would you perceive it, how it develops in the future? Because I just assume if there's enough gas absorbed over there, then in general the gas price must be lower, if I assume you're correct.
Start. That's, of course, both Europe and Russia, even before all the current problems started, for a long time already tried to diversify away from each other. Yeah? So Europe tried to diversify away. And Russia has also been trying to diversify because it clearly it had massive amount of gas being exported to Europe and relatively a small amount to Asia. And particularly for pipeline gas, of course, it's difficult because you have to have infrastructure, fixed infrastructure to do it as opposed to LNG. And they, of course, now intensified all their contacts, all the attempts to increase before the end of this decade exports to China. There is some infrastructure in place at Power of Siberia, so they're talking about expansion, so this route through Mongolia. In my view, that is going to happen, but of course that is going to take time. Of course, it's not going to compensate fully for the loss of Russian exports into Europe. Of course, accent also is going to be made on LNG development. So Russia wants to become, is already quite a big player now in LNG, and of course wants to develop this dimension to export gas to other countries. But the point I'm trying to make is that all of this takes time. None of it is easy. All of this also is expensive. But this crisis, of course, gave acceleration to these processes that have been more of a kind of in a slow motion. Yeah.
Anna Maria, do you have anything to add to this? No. Okay. Ben.
Yeah, just a couple quick thoughts. So on the oil side, I think Russia's been quite successful in redirecting its exports from Europe towards India and China. India went essentially from zero in 2020 to more than 1 million barrels a day of oil imports from Russia in recent months, at sometimes up to 1.4 That's a huge change. It was already a big exporter to China, both through pipelines and through seaborne exports. I think it was about 1.6 million barrels a day before the war. It has increased a little bit. It sold a bit more to Turkey. Interestingly, Russia is now selling more oil and petroleum products to the Middle East as well, and flows are changing from there to other regions. So there's this great reordering of crude and product flows around the world. So far, Russia's been pretty successful. I think they may be running up to a limit in terms of how much more these countries can really take. And with petroleum products, the market is different than for crude oil. You can buy a barrel of crude, as long as you can run it in your refinery, you can send the product somewhere else. Russia is now competing directly with refiners in India and China for the refined products that it wants to sell. So it can't place them in the market as easily. One potential consequence of this is that if it doesn't have anywhere to put it, it will have to reduce its refinery runs, produce less of the stuff, and try to export more crude. So I mentioned before, the market has stayed pretty well supplied. It's been pretty successful. I think the expectation is that over time, Russia will be a little bit more stressed. The last thing I'd say is that I personally think that Russian oil and gas production is going to be pretty resilient in the short term, more than many people believe. But the long-term picture is pretty bleak. I mean, it's lost a huge amount of access to technology, partnerships. The Western companies, Western oilfield services companies, the majors have said they don't want to do business with Russia anymore. In the LNG industry, they have a real problem. They have another big project coming. It's not completed yet, I think, Arctic LNG 2. After that, they've tried to do some stuff themselves, and it has not worked out very well. So they're really going to struggle, I think, to add more. And yes, they will definitely export more pipeline gas to China. That's the dream. That's kind of the quest for them. I think the last time they negotiated the price with China, it took 12 years. So this is not easy to do. The Chinese know that they have Russia over a barrel. They have a lot of leverage. So it's going to be kind of tough for them, I think.
Yes, in the middle.
Thank you. Martí Serra from Universitat Pompeu Fabra too. I think one of the main topics, like the elephant in the room in the EU-US relations right now, is kind of the reactions to the Inflation Reduction Act, and I think it's something that has been on the scene for a bit, because there's been like attacks to the. We all celebrate the fact that the US starts to get a bit more tough on climate change, but there has been attacks saying that it can affect EU competitiveness in the industry. It's also discriminatory for EU green energies and so on and so on. And basically I wanted to know, which is first, I think there was a meeting between Macron and Biden said they could try to coordinate and align policies. I don't know if that could be possible, maybe for you this question, Mr. Cahill. For Mr. Sanchez also, which is your position and which is EU's position on this topic? Because we know that there was some kind of disgust with this policy. And maybe more in an overall or general question, the IRA and some of the CHIPS Act and several things that have been passed recently, and the problems with the WTO also from the United States, it kind of portrays a future where the US is like retrieving from the same international liberal order they created in terms of trade at least. And I wanted to know this, which is your opinion on this topic, and if we're seeing the creation of two kind of separate blocks where the EU is kind of dependent on the US in a kind of liberal bloc, and there is kind of something more abstract, indeterminate bloc. And which is your opinion of this? How can it develop on the future, and how can the states react to this? Thank you.
That's great. Well, several questions for, I think all of our speakers can take a stab at. Perhaps we will go Ben, Anna Maria, and then Katja to finish.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a good one. So there's definitely protectionist elements of IRA, no doubt. And the frustration is real. I've had a lot of meetings this week, and this constantly comes up. People are really curious about the IRA, but clearly they're worried about the threat to European industry. Something has changed. Traditionally in the United States, the Republicans were the party of free trade and kind of the voice of big business. And that's kind of gone away. And by the way, this predated President Trump. I think that was kind of the change that was there even before. And the Democrats have really seized on this idea of clean energy as an economic strategy, kind of a central part of their economic platform. There is a real desire to build more things at home. and to use this to create manufacturing jobs, to boost economic activity in some struggling areas. And there's a real fear that as we transition towards clean energy, we're going to be too dependent on China. And so I think that's why there's so much focus on building things at home and the protectionist elements. I know there's a lot of frustration with it in Europe and in Asia as well, countries like Japan and Korea. But it's the law now. I mean, it's legislation, it's passed. So a president actually can't do much to claw it back. You know, we have to write guidance on the specific rules and taxes and the implementation of it all, so there's a little bit of wiggle room, but not very much. So there's a tension between this and trade order and the WTO, no doubt. I mean, I think the US has kind of gone a different direction. Europe, I expect, is going to respond, and you know, the WTO is going to lose some of its oomph in global trade. I don't know.
Anna Maria?
Yes. Well, in a way, our response, and I can't really give much more details because it's going to come fairly soon, is the already pre-announced Green Deal industrial plan. I mean, at the end of the day, we European companies or American companies, they are competing for the same markets, and we have also a lot of companies in Europe. They are international companies, so they are also having their activity in the US or beyond other non-EU markets. But of course, reaction. But we will be coming up now with a specific plan because it's in our interest to keep the industries. It's about jobs. It's about high-skilled jobs. When we speak about clean technology, there's a lot to come up in terms of development, and this is it's in our interest. And as I said, I can't really pre-announce too much because this plan will be announced. I think it was planned for mid-March, and let's see where we go from there. But I mean, we are all competing, and in Europe, of course, we want to keep as many companies as possible in our market.
Katja, last word.
Oh, thank you. Just a very quick comment on the last question in terms of whether we see sort of world really divergent sort of, autocracies versus democracies, and each decides their own problems separately, and that of course would spell the end of the legal rules as we now know them, and all these institutions, including WTO, are going to be severely tested, and probably still an open question whether they will stand that test. But again, personally, I think it really would be, if this were to happen, that would really be a way into nowhere, that the situation where everybody loses to significant, albeit varying extents. But of course, and in such reconfiguration, in such new constellation of relationships, it's extremely difficult to see how problems, particularly of a global magnitude such as climate change, are going to be decided just within the trusted partners. And what about the rest? Or they're going to decide it separately on the same planet? So I'm deeply skeptical about that. And I think the way this year has gone after 24th of February of 2022, a lot of this enthusiasm early on, which many believe that it is possible, that it could work out, you just need to put more effort. I think the evidence on the ground that it really isn't that easy, isn't really working that well. So maybe there will be a bit of a reverse gear on that, but we'll see.
Wonderful. As it's now 6:21, I'm afraid I will have to draw this session to a close. Just to remind everyone that there's now a break, and I would ask that you come back promptly for 10 minutes to 7. And before you leave, however, I would ask you to join me in a round of applause to our panelists and thank them for a wonderful discussion.